The day my mother uttered those words, my world went pitch black. If I had known about your developmental disorder, I wouldn't have had you. You are an unnecessary existence for our family, she declared, her voice cold and sharp. My father, oblivious to the devastation he was inflicting, leaned out the car window and shouted, "Let's go. From now on, a new life begins for the three of us." They left me behind, laughing as they drove away. I stood there, frozen, a 10-year-old girl named Tracy, abandoned by the only family I had ever known. Fast forward 15 years, and I was turning 25. My twin brother, Tony, and I had been living apart for over a decade due to the events that unfolded that chilling March day. My childhood was ordinary. My father worked a regular job, and my mother juggled part-time work and being a housewife. We were an average family, like so many others. But everything changed when we started elementary school. My brother's academic talents blossomed. He consistently aced tests, and my mother said, "Tony, you got a perfect score again. You are so talented and destined for greatness." My father would chime in with booming laughter. He might become a scholar, a doctor, or maybe an athlete. At least he won't have to worry about money. Meanwhile, I struggled. The constant sounds of shuffling chairs and the clicking of mechanical pencils distracted me in class. I couldn't concentrate, leading to frequent scolding from teachers. As I was reprimanded, my parents showered my brother with attention. Meals were always tailored to his preferences, and he was the only one taken on outings and fun adventures. He could have anything he wanted, anytime. I, on the other hand, was largely ignored. If I had spoken to teachers or other adults about my parents' neglect, maybe things could have changed. But I couldn't bring myself to speak up. I struggled with verbal communication and expressing my emotions. My words were jumbled and scattered. As an adult, I could communicate my thoughts, but I still felt misunderstood, often giving irrelevant responses. According to my mother, I was born with a mild developmental disorder. While I had made progress as an adult, I still faced significant challenges. As a child, I was difficult for adults to handle, but that wasn't a reason to neglect me. I was growing, learning, and evolving. My parents, however, saw me as a naive child, often looking down on me and comparing me to my talented brother. They held absolute authority, and I, unable to rebel, simply smiled and endured their words and actions. My relationship with Tony, once close, also began to shift as he grew older. My excellent brother didn't try to understand me. He started to treat me with disdain. "Don't talk to me at school," he'd say. "It's good our faces are different. I wouldn't want anyone to think we're siblings. Keep quiet, you're stupid." The kind words he once used disappeared, replaced by disdain. He treated me as if I were disgusting, eventually ignoring me completely. Naturally, my parents didn't notice or care about how Tony treated me. I no longer received their attention or affection. My days were reduced to receiving minimal care, and even on special occasions like birthdays and Christmas, I was left alone. My parents would take Tony out to eat, while I was left with a supermarket-bought meal and a discount sticker. Even on New Year's Eve, I was confined to my room. "You stay in your room," my father told me, "because I can't concentrate with you around." My New Year's celebration consisted of eating snacks alone in my room, straining to hear the happy voices from the living room. "You don't need study materials, do you?" "Since you can't do anything," my parents said, matter-of-factly. Tony, however, received a desk and educational supplies. I lost all motivation to study, and my grades plummeted. I felt like I had no place at school or home. The only solace I found was with my grandparents, who lived far away. We could only visit them twice a year, during summer and end-of-year holidays, and I was forbidden from speaking. My grandparents' house was in a nature-rich countryside, which my brother and parents found boring. But for me, it was a wonderland. I was mesmerized by the beauty of nature, spending hours coloring on the back of flyers and trying to capture the vibrant landscapes. My parents and brother scorned my drawings, but my grandparents hung them on the refrigerator, saying, "It's a beautiful drawing of the sunset." I felt an unprecedented joy, not just because they displayed my scribbles, but because they understood what I wanted to express without words. They loved my brother, but treated us twins equally, making my visits to their house a source of emotional support. Then, one chilly day in March, just as spring break began, my parents dropped a bombshell. "We've sold our apartment," my father announced. Confused, I asked, "What do you mean?" My brother snickered, "You're really stupid. It's been sold. A new life awaits us in a new house. If the house is sold, where will we live? What about school? When is the move? Why?" I was overwhelmed by the sudden news. My father yelled angrily, "Shut up. Your talk is always pointless. It's because you didn't notice, even though we've been preparing for a long time. Pack your stuff quickly." Until that moment, I hadn't realized the living room was already packed up. Confined to my room, I hadn't noticed things gradually disappearing from the house. Panicking, I held back tears and packed my belongings into cardboard boxes. I could only take a few toys and a minimal amount of clothes. It was spring break, so I had most of my belongings at school, which I quickly packed. "I'm ready," I said. "Everything is packed in boxes. I've got my school bag too. But anything else we don't need." My father tossed my cardboard box into the trunk of the car and told me to get in. But Tony wasn't there. "Tony isn't here," I said. "Where's Tony? It can't be just us three going, right? Aren't we missing some luggage?" My mother snapped, "Aren't you supposed to be quiet in the car?" I fell silent. "It's hard to understand you," she said. "We gave your brother some pocket money and let him go out to play. Be quiet if you understand." In the silence, I stared absent-mindedly at the blossoming trees outside the car window. A flicker of hope ignited in my heart. Maybe they were taking me to a fun place, just like they used to take only Tony. Perhaps they were trying to surprise me with the move. I unconsciously smiled. My parents were quietly talking, but I was too excited to care about what they were saying. I never imagined that my joy would be so cruelly betrayed. I eventually fell asleep and was abruptly awakened by my mother's loud voice. "Wake up quickly. Take your school bag and get out of the car." Disoriented, I got out of the car and was stunned by the scene before me. We were in front of my grandparents' house. "Yay! Grandma! Grandpa!" I tried to open the door, but it was locked. "Mom, I can't get in. It's a weekday, so they are probably still at work," my mother said. "But I just called them. They will be back soon," I said. My father roughly placed my luggage in front of the entrance and returned to the car. Feeling anxious, I grabbed my mother's hand. "Wait. Where are you going, Mom? Dad, wait. Where are we going? We can't leave your brother alone, can we?" My mother shook off my hand and said, "Your brother got into a famous private elementary school that ensures progression through grades. He's already decided to transfer there starting next term. We sold the apartment as part of the tuition, and we're moving to a new house for him. But having you around distracts him and adds extra food costs. With a new term starting, this is your chance to stay here." Wait, what's happening? Am I changing schools? Am I going to a different school? That's exactly what annoys me. My mother yelled, her anger rising. I was speechless. "You've always been a burden to me since you were little. Your grades are poor, and your appearance is below average. You can't even hold a proper conversation. Your brother is such a good child. Why do you always cause problems? Did I do something bad? If so, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't need empty apologies. If I had known about your developmental disorder, I wouldn't have had you. You are an unnecessary existence for our family." My world went dark. "Let's go. From now on, a new life begins for the three of us." My father stuck his head out the car window and declared that loudly. "I must stop them somehow. Don't go. Don't leave me behind. Dad. Mom. Am I a bad child?" Words swirled in my mind, but when I tried to speak, the right words wouldn't come out easily. I desperately moved my mouth, but my mother only glanced at me and got in the car. "Sorry for the wait," she said. "Since we've come all this way, let's buy a famous cake from around here and eat it with Tony." I could only watch, numb and heartbroken, as my parents drove away, leaving me alone with my grandparents. "Tracy, are you okay?" my grandfather asked, his voice laced with concern. "Tracy, try Grandpa." Through my blurred vision, I saw my grandparents looking at me with worry. I had fallen asleep, waiting for them to return. Your hands are cold, and your face is pale, my grandfather said, wrapping me in a jumper and carrying me to a warm room. My grandparents were moving quickly, talking in angry tones. How long has Tracy been waiting there? They couldn't believe it when they saw a message on their phones. They had been at work. We've left Tracy in front of the house. Please take care of Tracy. They rushed back home immediately. It would have been a disaster if they hadn't found me. My grandfather was a craftsman, and my grandmother worked diligently at a local restaurant. They were busy, but my parents hadn't contacted them in advance. They had only sent a message that day, and the communication ended abruptly. It was a painful reminder of how insignificant I was to my parents. As I sipped the hot milk my grandmother gave me, its warmth soothed my feelings. I couldn't stop my tears. My grandmother gently stroked my back, comforting me. My grandfather stood up and called my father. The discussion escalated quickly, and he slammed down the receiver. Tracy, I talked to your dad, but it seems we can't communicate properly, he said. Can you tell me what happened? Through my tears, I explained the events that had led me to this moment. My story was more disjointed than usual, but my grandparents listened quietly. They said I'm an unnecessary existence because I have a developmental disorder. They said it would have been better if I hadn't been born. Mom and Dad are going to create a new family with Tony. I choked out the words, tears streaming down my face. My grandmother hugged me tightly. What are you talking about? You are a wonderful child, no matter what anyone says. You are irreplaceable to us. I am truly happy that you were born. People's worth isn't determined by their intelligence or appearance. Your grandfather and I are just ordinary elderly people who didn't go to prestigious schools. But we've lived our lives utilizing what we're good at. You might not be good at academics, but you have a talent for sensitivity and expression. That's an irreplaceable talent, uniquely yours. Talent, I whispered. Yes, my grandfather said. There are no adults here to make you sad anymore, so you don't have to worry. I'm sorry for not noticing it until now. You've been doing your best. He stroked my head, and I was overwhelmed with emotion, bursting into tears again. My grandparents held me tight until my sobs subsided. After that, I started living with my grandparents. They enrolled me in a small local elementary school where the teachers were very understanding. One of them was the first person, besides my grandparents, who truly understood me. Because it was a rural area with few students, they implemented an educational program tailored to individual needs, which took my unique characteristics into account and helped me progress. My grades, which had been dismal, started to improve significantly. Even though I struggled with communication, I came to accept my unique traits and eventually made friends. I began to live a relaxed life, both mentally and physically. I found what I truly wanted to do. 15 years passed. During that time, I never heard from my parents or my brother. Their addresses and phone numbers had all changed. Their faces were fading from my memory. Then one day, the sound of someone banging violently on the door shattered the early morning calm. My grandparents were already awake, and I, still groggy, headed to the entrance. After leaving your daughter for over a decade, what do you want now? My grandfather shouted, his voice laced with anger. Startled by my grandfather's words, I stepped outside and widened my eyes. Well, if it isn't Tracy, my mother said. You've grown so much. The mother I remembered was always well kept, but the woman in front of me looked worn out and tired. The man next to her had a belly, a far cry from my father's previously slim figure. Smiling amiably, they reached out their hands in a friendly manner. I avoided their hands and glared at them. If you're my parents, why have you come? Don't talk like we're strangers, my mother said. We came to talk. Yes, we are fully aware, my grandfather said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It seems this workshop is making quite a profit now. Dad has gotten old, and as both a manager and a craftsman, he's reaching his limits, right? That's why we've come back. I thought I'd take over the business, and we heard our lovely daughter is set to inherit from him. That should be ours to receive. My grandfather snorted at their words. Oh, you came back to get a share of the leftovers and even take over the business? How presumptuous. An amateur with no basic knowledge of glass artistry taking over our workshop? We've already decided on our successor. What? Tracy? She will take over? She's a genius? What ridiculousness. This child who can't do anything. My grandmother, as if to interrupt my father, threw a newspaper at his face. What are you doing? Look inside, you fool. There's an article about this workshop. My father flipped through the newspaper, his eyes widening as he alternated between looking at me and the newspaper in shock. Young glass artisan from local workshop to the world. It was an article from a recent interview. By the time I was in middle school, I had become fascinated by my grandfather's work. I had started helping out in the workshop around that time, initially as an assistant. But as I started to actively engage in glass artistry, I quickly became an apprentice in my grandfather's workshop, recognized for my skills. I became passionate about capturing the allure of nature in glass. A few years ago, I finally completed the piece I had dreamed of making and started selling it. It became popular on social media, and I quickly gained recognition, becoming known as a prominent glass artisan. Now, I even receive orders from restaurants and stores abroad, and we have expanded our workshop with more artisans and launched online sales. You are indeed our daughter, not like that useless, timid son, my father said, exaggerating his praise. My mother eagerly nodded along. Useless, timid? I was surprised by the words, so opposite from my memory of my brother. My mother glared at me sharply. Just listen. That useless Tony, she began speaking excitedly. According to her, my brother had graduated from university and landed a job at a top company. Everything was going well initially. But having been praised as excellent for years, he became arrogant and unexpectedly fragile, buffeted by the harsh waves of society. He faced failure within a short time and quit his job less than a year after starting. Can you believe it? Just a little scolding, and he quit his job, she said. I could never imagine it. Now he mostly stays in his room, hardly ever coming out, except for the bathroom or shower. We quit our jobs because Tony had started working. Hey, Dad, setting aside the inheritance issue, you have money, right? Can't you take care of us three, or even just us two? My grandfather's expression turned to astonishment at my father's words. Do you two only care about yourselves? He's still young. He'll figure something out. If it's decided that we stay here, he'll manage somehow. He's not a child anymore. We can't find new jobs at our age. Hey, Dad, listen to your loving son's request, my father said. My grandfather, dumbfounded, sighed and went back into the room. My mother looked at me intently. You should live with your mom and dad too, right? Oh, I forgot. You don't understand what we're talking about anyway, do you? All you need to do is nod along while saying yes. My mother's eyes were bloodshot. My father nodded in agreement. After thinking for a moment, I responded, Why do I have to live with strangers? We are your real parents. We raised you, my father said. When I lived with my parents as a child, I never felt like I was being cared for, I said. I barely existed. It was my grandparents and my teachers who truly raised me. I continued speaking to them, frozen in shock. You may be my parents by law, but I have no memory of that. I can't live with strangers. I look at you completely as strangers. If I was wrong, my grandparents would correct me. Their silence probably meant it was okay. My grandfather watched with a smile. My father looked at him. Don't you think that's a terrible thing to say, Dad? Say something. Indeed, if you want me to, I'll say something too. It's strange to say you raised Tracy when you abandoned her at 10. No, not about me. Say something to Tracy. Tracy, say something to your grandfather. Something? No, I mean, that's not it. You told me to say something, so I said something. My father began to flush with frustration. My grandfather started laughing, a chuckle that turned into a full-blown guffaw. Don't abandon us, hey Dad. My father pleaded. My grandfather waved his hand away and shouted in a low voice, Enough already. Why would you say such spoiled things now? At my grandfather's stern voice, my father and mother froze in place. During this pause, my grandmother hurried to the kitchen. When she returned, she had a large bag in her hand. This is perfect now. Get out, you bad luck, she said, throwing salt at my mother's face. Ouch! What is this? Salt? The bag my grandmother holds contains salt used for cooking. Parents who abandon their children are the epitome of bad luck, my grandmother said calmly, continuing to throw salt at my parents' faces. Go back already. I'll keep throwing salt until you leave. We have plenty of salt, so be prepared. Next to her, my grandfather stood holding a new bag. Leave, he shouted, forcefully throwing salt. The salt flew with force, hitting my parents directly in the face. Hey, Dad. Mom. Stop, please. Stop it already, my parents cried out. But my grandparents continued to throw salt, motionlessly shouting, Go back already. Never come back. My parents desperately clung to my hand. Are you going to abandon your parents? We're drowning in debt and struggling to live. Shouldn't family help us out? My family is only my grandparents, I responded. I forcefully shook off their wrinkled hands. My parents crumbled beside me. I took the bag from my grandmother and declared, This is goodbye forever. With that, I emptied the contents of the bag over my parents. That moment was decisive. My parents, disheartened, fled as if running away. As time passed, my brother appeared at our workshop. The debt collectors chasing my parents had left him behind when they fled the house at night. Soon, the debt collectors came to evict my brother, leaving him distraught. The police took him in, and as the only relatives they could contact, they reached out to my grandparents. One who does not work does not eat, my grandfather said. If you work hard and help out in the workshop, we'll provide a place to live and meals. What do you say? Surprisingly, my brother agreed immediately. His work in the workshop was still unpolished, and he was often scolded by my grandfather and other staff. But once he started showing talent in online sales and accounting, he became indispensable to the workshop. My brother, now a grown man, was ashamed of his past actions and now acknowledged and supported my abilities. It was still too early to say we had reconciled, but I found it both delightful and embarrassing that he was now treating me kindly again. Interestingly, just when my brother was getting accustomed to the workshop's work and starting to be acknowledged by everyone, our parents suddenly contacted him. Tony, where are you and what are you doing? It's getting dangerous here. At worst, we might end up on a fishing boat. Please help us. Ignoring any mention of my brother's well-being after they left him behind and focusing only on themselves, my brother completely lost his patience. He changed all his phone numbers and email addresses, cutting off any means of contact from our parents. I wondered if those two were working on the sea now. As a result, both my brother and I truly felt relieved to have escaped from those parents. The dinner table, surrounded by my grandparents, my brother, and me, might not have special dishes, but it felt warm and comforting. In a slightly misshapen dish made by my brother, there were mashed potatoes cooked by my grandmother. My grandfather enjoyed his beer in a glass I had made. I was finally feeling a happiness I couldn't experience in my childhood.